But thank you, Ian and Sylvia, for that. We appreciate that. We also, thankfully, have only got half an hour. So we both prepared lengthy academic tomes to read out and bore the hell out of you. But what we'll do probably now is kind of try and shorten that a little bit and maybe make it a bit more of a conversation. And then hopefully have some questions as well. So basically, what the project was as Ian said, an Arts and Humanities Research Council project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to basically do networking. So what happens is that they give a certain amount of funding, not a lot of money, about £30,000, in order to bring people, institutions, artists together to talk about certain issues, surface some of the issues that come out of those conversations, and then in theory to be able to apply for more money in a second stage to go deeper into the research. So this was not really a research project, it was more of a networking project, bringing institutions together, right? So the institutions that we brought together were the Wolverhampton Art Gallery, where we are now, of course, the New Art Exchange in Nottingham, Nottingham Contemporary, and the Herbert Gallery and Museum in Coventry. Okay? The project was called The Role of the Visual Arts Organisations in the Black British Arts Movement in the Midlands. And it was a project that was initiated by Professor Carolina Rito of Coventry University, and she invited me to come in with her to co-lead the project. And as Ian said, it operated between 2021 and 23. So when we started the project, we did at least a year of the project online, where we didn't really get a chance to meet any of the institutions. The institutions were closed. We had lots of meetings on Zoom, which, as you know, are quite difficult. It's only really toward the end of the project that we got together to have some of the conversations. So what the project was doing was really looking at the legacy of the Black British art movement, the work that you've been looking at in the exhibition, and also the subject of this conference. And then thinking about what that legacy means for the care, conservation, stewardship of those works and those artists by some of the institutions that were part of the network, right? So we wanted to do two things really. One is to focus on and celebrate the role of the Midlands in instituting many of these practices around Black British art. And often, coming from London, when we talk about black art, it's rarely mentioned that actually black art was born in Britain, was born here in the Midlands, and specifically in Wolverhampton, right? Those kinds of conversations just don't happen. So, on a kind of broader national and international perspective. So the project really wanted to focus on that and think about what those institutions, the role of those institutions, but also to think alongside that about some of the, if you like, quasi or para-institutional practices that many of the artists and collectives that were involved, such as the Black Art Group, in this. So it wasn't just a case of black artists just giving their works to institutions, right? Black artists were organised in collections, such as the Pan-African Connection, such as the Black Art Group, and others. And many of the black artists, such as Marlene, such as Lubena Hamid, many of the artists, Ajamu, were not only artists, but also curators. So within the kinds of conversations we've been having, in thinking about the role of black art and institutions, we also had another discourse about the kind of informal institutions or informal structures that black artists themselves created, which goes back to Candice's questions about care and preservation, etc. And many of those groups and curators were doing that work with varying success, with little support, very much in the undercommons, very much in the underground, and doing that care and love in relation to those works. So, of course, we wanted to also take note of the way in which the aftermath of George Floyd, death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the role and the prominence of the Black Lives Matter protests, which impacted on universities and museums and society at large around the world, and there were calls for decolonization and change in museums. And we wanted to map that as well in the conversations that we had with these institutions. So how did it work? Well, what we wanted to do, at the core of the project, was this networking program, bringing different groups together. So the network brought together stakeholders with relevant experience in the history of black art movement in the 70s and 80s, people like Marlene Smith and Shaheen as well. We formed a working group of people who informed the research, so that involved Marlene and Shaheen, and also we wanted to talk to black practitioners and researchers in the field. Sylvia and Ian were part of that working group, to really kind of come in and give us have conversations and lend their expertise. And some of that is reflected in the publication that we produced that documented the project. I'll talk a bit about that later. So we brought together the 4 partner organizations based in the region, as I've mentioned. But we also engaged with external experts such as Jagdish Patel, who is a researcher and an activist, and also organizers of black-led organizations in the region, such as Laura Nayahui, to come as guest speakers in some of the workshops that we organized. So the first of these workshops took place at New Art Exchange in Nottingham in December 22, after we had a year of meetings with most of the groups, individually and collectively. And in that event, which took place at New Art Exchange in Nottingham, the New Art Exchange, the Herbert Gallery, and the Wolverhampton Art Gallery basically made presentations based on how these works and how the works of black artists inspires their collections and their curatorial practices. So, for example, Carol here from the Wolverhampton Art Gallery very much did a presentation which focused around the Black Art Undone exhibition in '81, and in fact, in the publication we have a text by Carol explaining that and what the impact of that was on the institution, and how that has guided and helped the institution to move forward with these works today. And Shaheen will talk a bit more about that particular workshop and go into a bit of a deep dive on that. The second workshop took place here at the Wolverhampton Art Gallery and focused more on looking at the informal institutional practices that supported black artists and anti-racist movements. And we had a fantastic presentation by Jagdish Patel, who kind of gave an overview of the intersections between anti-racist movements and the kind of socially engaged arts practices that happened in the Midlands in the 60s and 80s. And that presentation was so important because, again, a very neglected and important part of British art history, which is kind of often hidden under the centralised kind of discourses around London or etc. and big cities. And in fact, some of the movements that supported, in other words, he was looking at the way in which the activism, community movements, etc., fed in and had a kind of symbiotic relationship with many of the art practices, which was really important. And then we also, in that workshop here, Laura Nayahui talked about her experience as the director of a black-led arts organisation called Mayoko, and the importance of how she worked with the Herbert Museum in quite difficult circumstances to try and effect change, particularly as a black woman and as an artist. And then we produced a publication, which you can download from the site of the project. And the title of the publication, in a way, sums up our collective attitude towards the project and toward these institutions and the relationship with black art. And it's called The Changing Same. And we took that title, The Changing Same, from an essay by the writer Amiri Baraka or Leroy Jones in 1966, where he wanted to talk about the ways that new forms of black music that emerged in the 60s, he wanted to kind of really theorize that music, and he kind of argued that much of the new freeform jazz took place in a context, the form of the jazz changed from traditional jazz, but the essential conditions that underlined or that produced this music remained the same. The logics of exclusion, the ways in which the state attacks and downgrades black culture. These things don't change, but yet black culture persists, it innovates, and it changes all the time. And the same thing, I think, with black artists' work. So we use the title Changing Same to talk a bit about this relationship between black artists and the institutions. The publication itself was structured around three main sections. One is an overview of the project and the aims and objectives. Secondly, there were a number of interviews with some of the key participants in the project. So Marlene, Ian, Laura, and Sylvia gave really interesting interviews about their experiences of working as artists and curators within these institutions, and also gave us some recommendations about perhaps ways forward. And then finally, there's a third section which focused on reflections and recommendations from the institutional partners, but also from myself and Caroline in taking into account what the interviews talked about. So that's a kind of high-level overview of the project. And I'll hand over to Shaheen now to just give a deep dive into one of the sessions, that first session in Nottingham. As, Shaheen was present and he made quite a lot of notes. So, Shaheen.
Thank you. Is that all right? Sure. No, sorry. Yeah. All right, so because of the fact that this was a safe place and there was a necessity for there to be a safe place for people to have open conversations, I won't go into who said what and why, but I'm just trying to make notes from what was delivered on the day. The fact that there was a necessity for a safe space within an institution and about how institutions work was in itself an interesting idea, because a lot of the people who were there, present there, felt they had competing allegiances. And that comes out in the way that things are talked about. So I'm going by my notes and some of the ideas and interests which were talked through over a period of a whole day. What came out around the legacy, let's say, of political black arts was that it was seen particularly as an interesting momentum. And I'm using that in inverted commas. A momentum in a sense that it allowed for these institutions to work within their limitations and then to work through possibilities which would have not been possible if it wasn't for that particular momentum. It was seen as an opportunity to articulate what was not necessarily being articulated within the institutions in the first place. Now, what happens within the idea of a momentum is that there is, of course, a kind of celebratory notion to a momentum. We're celebrating this. And I think a lot of artists at a particular point in their careers felt, and I know that this has been discussed in the past, that this is not about celebration, this is about a practice. So they themselves were compromised by the way things were produced for them. Now, one can say to a certain extent that there was a celebration of anti-racism, or there was a celebration of a certain presence of gendered balance. And I think what happens is that the exhibitions themselves had to remind the organizations, the institutions, that there was a necessity for these conversations, not only through those lenses, but other lenses. The notion of the safe place was really interesting because people did talk about their institutions quite openly. They shared their understanding of what a public space is, what it can do, what it can't do, how they can collect, how they cannot collect, what was the conditions at that time over the period of the critical decade of the 1980s, and how the limitations affected even their policy to collect. But what also happened, which was talked about quite openly, was that this narrative, which was in the exhibitions around political black arts, and possibly in the black art group, played a role for the notion of memory, and to try to create a space where, and this is again in inverted comma, a factory of connections can be made. That term was a bit abrupt, a bit weird, it struck a chord when it was announced, a factory of connections. But part of the way that the institutions talked about black art, to a certain extent, was that it possibly allowed them to play a role within the regional context through this factory of connections. And in that sense, what we're talking about is that this history then becomes part of the history of the region and doesn't become a history of the nation. And that's where we are stuck at the moment, is that regionally, these things are celebrated. So the third coming, in a sense, of this convention is partly because the region is celebrating the very fact, what you suggested, that this is where it came from. Now, there is also a loss of momentum, which was brought up. And the loss of momentum was something which is also interesting for us to hear about, only because there was a lot, what was called zones of discomfort that came in when political black art was shown, was exhibited, was curated. At one time, somebody pointed out, at the time of the killing of George Floyd, there was a zone of discomfort. Now, I'm going to leave it slightly there for you to think why that would affect an institution, its audience, and how it presents a hurdle for the teams. But it does present a hurdle for them to try and go further on or move on. But they did say that the investment within the institutions differed along different lines. The board had a very different idea of what the institutions does, what the team does, what the curators do, and sometimes even what the audience want out of it. All of these aspects were brought out and were presented both as something which could instill them to work and act on, or to defer and work with it in that manner. On a positive side, what happened for within these exhibitions and within trying to buy the work of political black artists was that they felt an involvement which was more citizen-led rather than led by the council. Now, the role of the council, as you know, has played a great amount in especially regional museums, galleries, and how they operate, what they collect even, and what they show on a regular basis, so what becomes a permanent exhibition. So the involvement of the citizen, in a sense, the artist as a citizen, the curator as a citizen, the programmer as a citizen, is defined by the bodies that come in alongside these sort of exhibitions, which are very specific, because they're contesting the notion of beauty, the notion of taste, for instance. They attract a different audience, they work with different neighborhoods, and in a sense, they also co-pilot within the organization, which was seen to a large extent as being something which was necessary to allow certain talent, which they know exists, to actually surface. The openness to community members was important for greater participation to occur, for the events, in a sense, to be more constructed along the lines of residencies and education and community-based relationships. But even these aspects faced resistance throughout the last 15, 20 years we were talking about. A lot of resources seemed also to be ring-fenced before you can bring anything else in or anything different in, and that created a problem for people sitting around the table who were not made aware of these decisions had been made by another body, which they had to reflect upon. So the idea of co-creation as a methodology was mooted at that time. That maybe the way to go forward to be more successful and to enter a dialogue is to construct curatorship events which are co-authored, co-created, and maybe even not give one curator or two curators the chance to select the shows, but have a group of curators who work together to create an event or create an exhibition, to expand and, in a sense. All right, so there was a second thing which happened in one of the institutions which is worthwhile bringing out, that a lot of the spaces in the regions are dependent on being spaces fit for purpose. What that means is that if the space is fit for purpose, the Tate will be involved, the Baltic might be involved, a touring show might come here. If the space is not fit for purpose, it doesn't happen. So the regional spaces are effectively working with making the spaces fit for purpose to attract the attention of the Turner Prize, or the Tate, or the touring show, which in a sense defines them as being part of a circuit, but not necessarily working with the community, which is also part of their circuit. Now, I can carry on about the struggles they have, but I do think that what we need to move in is the conclusions. Yeah.
So just really quickly, I think one of the questions that came out of this project relates very much to Candice's questions, which is the question of care. How do we care about the legacy, or how these institutions care about the legacy of the Black Arts movement in the UK today, not just as a historical artifact, but as a way of informing current institutional practices? How is this work valued and supported? And how can it inform current and future programming in British art institutions in the Midlands and beyond? Now, the answer to that question varies very, very radically between the organisations, right? And again, we don't want to name names, but certainly we can say that Wolverhampton Art Gallery was much more proactive in some respects than many of the other art groups, partly because of the location of the movement, in Wolverhampton at that time, and the specific relationships. But there's also other institutional and historical reasons as to why Wolverhampton was perhaps more proactive. To answer that question, So we were interested in understanding how the caring about the legacy of the Black Arts movement had been transformed in the last 3 decades, and not least in the last 3 years, right? We wanted to ask our colleagues if the caring about this incredible legacy of Black art practice had mutated and transformed into a caring for a systemic equality across institutional functions, including workforce, governance, programming, and audience development. And I would say that, just to sort of sum up, the formulation of the changing same, to go back to the title of the publication, is how I think we can characterize the answer to this question. Some change has absolutely been observed. On the surface, there are more exhibitions, there are more, you see more black faces in certain galleries, there are more programs and community outreach programs perhaps than there were in the past, although maybe not, because in the 80s there was also a large number of these things. But the same old questions about the unequal distribution of power remain the same. And one could argue that in the last 3 years from the BLM protest, there has been some demonstrable changes, but a lot of these changes have been done in the name of the demands to decolonize museums and galleries, and the urgent need for institutions to react and to act against growing inequality. But we felt that what we observed was that institutions tended to take a reactive approach instead of a proactive one, right? Where they actually need to do the work of understanding the whys and the hows that respond to their situation. One area of interest that did emerge from discussions with participants and institutions was the need to generate a critical infrastructure devised and delivered by cultural institutions that allows them to be more self-reflexive and to carve out time for staff and audiences to develop more thought-provoking context for critical practices and thinking, such as the work of the Black Art Movement. Now, in the publication, we look at three main areas: institutional structures, funding structures, and critical infrastructures. And you can find out more of the specific recommendations that came out of the project there. So I think at that point, we'll probably open it up for any questions. 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
So in terms of what, accessing information from the exhibition?
Yeah.
I mean, this, because like this event itself is being recorded and it's going to be posted on the Black Art Group Research Project website. So both events, hopefully, sorry, keeps looking at it. Is it? Yeah, it will be. So that's why we're documenting these events. The first symposium that took place is actually on view in the resource room next door, so you can actually see what took place from the first show. A lot of the resources that we provide, a lot of the reading, and also I should say that there's a pile of third text journals that are available to take away. So if you want to take a copy, they're in the resource room. So we've kind of, that myself and Silva, we thought about that, the resource space as being that space where it was about that wider conceptualizing and understanding and framing of these kind of conversations. That's why we wanted to kind of create that space so that you could sit down with the work and get a wider understanding of the context in which a lot of that work was created and a lot of that thinking kind of took place. So that was the idea of why we kind of created the resource space in that regard.
Sure, thank you. We'll also make the publication available on the websites, hopefully, of the institutions such as Wolverhampton Art Gallery. I think the second part of that question was what happens now, right? What is the outcomes of this? So I guess that's the question for you guys. How do we continue this conversation?
Yeah, go.
I think the way that a lot of things are now organized, because of the access to technology, especially Zoom and online, a lot of material is available online. And a lot of the large-scale museums, including the Tate, has gone through a period of trying to work out how they're going to use the material they've got to make it more accessible, downloadable. So it's a matter of looking at what is out there in the field, working out what you think is not coming through, and having conversations with some of these people. That's how we started to get some of this material downloadable, by having conversations with the curators at the Tate, with the library of the Tate, where you say, you have this, I can come to it, but I can't come to it if I'm living outside of the city. Is it possible for you to at least work out a system of having the best material, which would be possible? Now, of course, there is a difficulty here that there is a selection going on, but you can start with a selection, and it starts the flow of information coming through. Without that flow of information in the first place, it's going to be very difficult to start anything. So it's really important that you also earmark what you want to see and ask for it. And that way, people will start addressing your questions. Even if it's down the line, at least the question is in the line.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add in response to what you were saying. I don't know if you're from the local. Are you from Wolverhampton? Okay, so I guess I'm just thinking that when events like this happen, it's also an opportunity to network and connect and talk to people. Sort of now, once we finish up, if you found like-minded that are kind of in a similar place in terms of how the conversations continue, that you can also be part of continuing those conversations with the people that you connect with and build relationships from here as well. So I just wanted to add that alongside what the institution may or may not put online or in spaces. I think it's coming back to that idea of like who owns knowledge and how we can also continue dialogue that doesn't necessarily need to also wait for somebody to put something somewhere. I think there is an element of you've had, meeting with other people around here and having those conversations alongside what Ian said and what Paul said as well.
Okay, we're gonna have to call it quits. Feels like we're gonna. Shall we start singing a song? No. Feels like we're lining up for. No, I ain't gonna start. No. So I want to thank Paul and Shaheen for this final session. Thank you, Paul. Shaheen, thank you. And then back to the top of the day, Marlene, Ajamu, who else was on there? Claudette and Jelaine. And then the second panel, Keith, Paul, Candice, Alice, and Shaheen. And then these two again. Thank you to Soundman, Marky G, Sab for the video work, Jonathan for the wonderful photography that will be available. Thank you to Wolverhampton Art Gallery, to Carol and Leonie and the technical team for making this happen. And thank you all for bearing with the wonderful, brought the tropical conditions inside. And for making it a really wonderful, wonderful occasion. You've got about half an hour. If you haven't seen the exhibition, you can speed view it. So I know we kind of talked about slow looking and stuff. This is fast looking. Grab a journal. The journal, the Third Text journal, is wonderfully donated by our co-chair from Third Text. Alice again, so thank you so much for offering those over for everybody to kind of divulge.
Thanks to you two for a brilliant exhibition.
No, thank you. So thank you all. Thank you for taking the time today. Sylvia, do you want to say anything? I'm done talking.
No, I think you said it all. Thank you all. Half an hour to see the show if you haven't seen it.
Yeah. Cheers. Thank you.